At my daughter's Thanksgiving dinner, my son-in-law looked me dead in the eye and said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, "You spent 40 years fixing other people's pipes. Keith spent 3 years building something real. Funny how that works." I didn't say a word. I picked up my fork and kept eating. But by the following Monday, he was scrambling to explain himself to people who actually mattered. And my daughter finally saw the man she'd married for exactly what he was. It had been a good fall-up to that point. Crisp air, coming in off the Smoky Mountains, the kind that makes East Tennessee feel like the whole world slowed down for just a little while. My daughter Sandra had moved into a nice split level outside Knoxville 3 years prior, after she married Colin. He was in commercial real estate, or so he said, depending on who was asking. Sometimes it was development, sometimes investment consulting, sometimes he'd just wave his hand and say, "Deals, you know." I never pushed. Sandra loved him, and I figured that counted for something. I drove up from Morristown that Wednesday evening, my old GMC Sierra loaded with a pecan pie Sandra's aunt had sent and a cooler full of the smoked turkey I'd been doing every year since my wife Dorothy passed 8 years back. That turkey was the one tradition I held on to like a lifeline. Dorothy used to say my smoking was the only useful thing I did in the kitchen. She wasn't wrong. Sandra met me at the door, her hug tight and genuine, the way it always was. She had her mother's eyes and her mother's warmth, and sometimes when the light hit her just right, I had to look away. Colin was in the living room with a bourbon, watching football, and he raised his glass at me without getting up. "Frank, good drive?" That was the extent of our greeting most visits. The other guests trickled in Thursday morning. Sandra's college friend and her husband, couple from Colin's office I'd never met, and Colin's younger brother Keith with his girlfriend. Keith was the one Colin talked about constantly. The one who'd figured it out, who was pulling in 6 figures doing online marketing or dropshipping or some other thing I couldn't quite follow. He was 29, drove a leased BMW, and had the easy confidence of someone who had never sat in a ditch in January fixing a burst main at 2 in the morning. Dinner itself started fine. Sandra had outdone herself. The turkey came out well, the sweet potatoes were perfect, and for a little while it felt like something close to normal. I sat at the end near Sandra's friend, talking about nothing in particular, and I was grateful for the quiet comfort of it. Then Colin refilled his wine and the conversation turned to money, the way it always does when people have had enough to drink and not enough sense. Keith was talking about a deal he'd closed, something involving warehouse space and some kind of online reseller network. Colin was nodding along like a proud parent, interjecting, "That's what I'm talking about," every few sentences. I wasn't paying close attention. I was working on my second slice of pie. "The thing is," Keith said, leaning back in his chair, "in this economy, you either adapt or you get left behind. No offense to the old school guys, but trades work is a dead end. You trade your body for a paycheck and then what?" I looked up. He wasn't looking at me. Not yet. Colin smiled into his wine glass. "Frank spent, 40 years in the trades, right? Plumbing?" 38 years, I said. "Retired now." "Right." Colin set his glass down and looked at me directly. 38 years fixing pipes. Keith's been at it 3 years and he's already cleared more than you probably made in your last decade. He paused, letting that settle. Funny how that works, right? The table went quiet. Sandra's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Colin's colleague glanced down at his plate. Keith had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable, though he didn't say anything. I didn't say anything either. I took a slow sip of my sweet tea, set it down carefully, and went back to my pie. The conversation moved on, the way conversations do when people don't know what else to do with a silence. But I heard it, every word of it, and something that had been patient in me for a long time stopped being patient. Later that night, after the dishes were done and Sandra had walked the other guests out, I sat on her back porch in the cold with a cup of decaf and let myself think. The mountains were just dark shapes against a darker sky. A neighbor's dog was barking somewhere down the hill. I thought about Dorothy, who had never once made me feel small for the work I did, who used to say that the plumbers and the electricians and the framers were the reason anyone had a warm house to come home to, who died in a house I'd kept in perfect shape for 31 years, every pipe, every fixture, every valve, because I knew how. I thought about Sandra, 7 years old, sitting on the bathroom floor watching me replace a wax ring, asking questions the whole time. Why is it called a wax ring, Daddy? Because it's made of wax, baby. That's not a very creative name. She'd made me laugh so hard I had to stop what I was doing. I thought about my retirement account, the one I'd been putting money into since 1987. About the rental property I owned free and clear in Morristown, the duplex I'd bought in 2004 and renovated largely myself. About Sandra's college tuition, which I'd paid every semester without a loan because I'd planned for it. I thought about Colin, who I happened to know, because Sandra had told me more than she probably should have, was carrying significant debt on 3 different properties that weren't performing the way he projected. And I thought about Keith's leased BMW. I wasn't angry in a hot way. I was angry in the way you get when something finally clarifies. Like when you've been hearing a sound in the walls for months and you finally find the source and you realize it's been sitting there the whole time, obvious, waiting. I went back inside, said goodnight to Sandra, and drove back to my hotel. I didn't sleep much, but by morning I knew what I needed to do. I want to be clear about something. I am not a petty man. I don't believe in cruelty. I spent my career solving other people's problems at 2 in the morning in weather that would make you want to quit, and I never once left a job half finished or made someone feel bad for needing help. But I also believe that respect is not something you keep extending indefinitely to someone who keeps burning it down. There's a difference between patience and being a doormat, and I'd been on the wrong side of that line for 3 years. The first call I made Friday morning was to my financial advisor, a woman named Beverly I'd been working with for 11 years. I told her I wanted to redirect the annual gift I'd been putting into Sandra and Colin's joint account. It wasn't a huge amount, $4,000 a year, the annual gift tax exclusion, but I'd been doing it consistently since they got married as a way of helping them build savings. Beverly understood without me having to explain much. "Separate account for Sandra only?" she asked. "Yes," I said. Her name only. The second call was to my attorney, the semi-retired guy in Morristown I'd known since we coached Little League together in the 90s. I wanted to update my will, and more specifically, I wanted to restructure how the rental property was designated. It had been set up to pass jointly to Sandra and her spouse. I wanted that changed. Sandra's share would go to a trust with conditions. Colin would have no claim on it whatsoever. My attorney said he could have the paperwork ready by mid-December. The third call was more personal. Colin had approached me twice in the past 2 years about investing in one of his development projects. Both times I'd declined politely, citing my preference for conservative holdings at my age. Both times he'd pushed a little, and both times I'd held the line. What I hadn't told Sandra was that the second time I'd actually done some digging. A contact of mine who worked in commercial lending had pulled what he could on Colin's business entity. The picture wasn't pretty. Over-leveraged, late on 2 loan payments in the past 18 months, one project that had stalled completely waiting on zoning approval that might never come. I hadn't said anything because I didn't want to put Sandra in the middle of something, and because I kept hoping I was wrong about Colin and that he'd eventually prove it. I wasn't wrong. I called my contact again Friday morning and asked him to send me everything in writing that was a matter of public record. Liens, late filings, whatever was available. He sent it to my email by noon. I forwarded it to my attorney and asked him to take a look. I didn't call Sandra that day. I needed to think before I did that. She called me Saturday afternoon. I was back home in Morristown, raking leaves in the backyard, the mountain air cold enough to see my breath. I let it ring twice before I answered, "Dad." Her voice was careful. Careful in the way it gets when she's carrying something she doesn't know how to put down. "Hey, sweetheart. I owe you an apology. What Colin said at dinner, it wasn't okay. I should have said something right then and I didn't, and I'm sorry." I leaned the rake against the fence and sat down on the back steps. "I appreciate that. I do. He was drunk and he was showing off for Keith and it still wasn't okay." She paused. "Are you mad at me?" "No," I said. "I'm not mad at you, but I want you to hear something and I need you to really listen." She was quiet. "I'm not going to pretend that what he said didn't tell me something true about how he sees me, and maybe how he sees the life I built. And I think you've been smoothing things over between us for a while now because you love us both, and I don't want you to have to keep doing that." "Dad, let me finish. I've made some adjustments this week. Financial things, estate things. Not to punish anybody, just to be smarter about what I've been doing. Some things I should have done sooner." I stopped, listening to the silence on her end. "And there's some information I think you need to see about Colin's business. Not because I want to blow anything up, but because you're my daughter and you deserve to know what's happening around you." She was quiet for a long moment. "What kind of information?" "The kind that explains why he's been under a lot of pressure lately, and maybe why he's been taking it out in the wrong places." I could hear her breathing slow down, the way it does when she's shifting from emotional to practical. Sandra was always good at that. Dorothy used to say our daughter had the warmest heart and the clearest head of anyone she'd ever known. "She was right, send it to me," Sandra said. I did, that afternoon. The public records, the late filings, the lien on the stalled project. I didn't editorialize, I just sent the documents. Colin called me that evening. I let it go to voicemail. His message was 5 minutes of carefully controlled anger wrapped in the language of reasonable concern. He said I was interfering in his marriage. He said the dinner comment had been a joke and I was being oversensitive. He said that if I was going to start involving lawyers and redirecting finances, he would have no choice but to protect his family's interests, and that Sandra would be upset when she understood what I was actually doing. I listened to it twice. Then I sent him a text that said, "Talk to Sandra. Then we can talk." He called again an hour later. I didn't answer. Sunday morning, Sandra called me again. Her voice was different this time. Quieter, more careful in a different way. "How long have you known about the liens?" "Since last spring," I said. I didn't say anything because I thought it might turn around. She exhaled. "He told me the project was just slow. He never said there were filings." "I know. He's been asking me to put some of my savings into it to help bridge a gap while the zoning worked out." She paused. "I've been going back and forth about it for 2 months." I closed my eyes. "Please don't do that, Sandra. I'm not going to." She sounded like she was holding herself very still. "Dad, I'm really glad you sent those documents. We talked for a long time after that. Not about Colin specifically, more about what she wanted her life to look like, what mattered to her, what she was afraid of. It was one of the most honest conversations we'd had in years." I sat in my kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear until my coffee went cold, and I wouldn't have traded that hour for anything. I did speak to Colin eventually, about 2 weeks later. He drove down to Morristown on a Saturday without Sandra, which told me she'd given him a clear boundary. He sat across from me at my kitchen table looking like a man who had rehearsed several versions of a speech and wasn't sure which one to give. He apologized. It was real enough as apologies go. He acknowledged the comment was out of line, that it was a pattern of behaviour he'd been called out on before, that he was under pressure he hadn't been handling well. I listened without interrupting. When he was done, I thanked him for saying it. Then I told him some things I should have said a year ago. I told him I didn't need his respect. I was 63 years old, I'd worked hard, I'd raised a daughter I was proud of, I'd built something solid. His opinion of my career was his business, but Sandra was my daughter, and what I'd sent her was not an attack on him. It was information she had a right to have, and if he ever again put her in a position of making financial decisions without knowing the full picture, I would not be quiet about it. He nodded. He didn't push back. I think he understood that the version of me who let things slide was gone. "I love your daughter," he said, near the end. "I know you do," I said. "Act like it." He drove back to Knoxville. I'm not sure what he said to Sandra when he got home. She called me that evening and said only, "Whatever you said, thank you." I told her I just told him the truth. She said that was more than enough. The estate documents were finalized in mid-December, right before Christmas. The rental property was moved into a trust with Sandra as sole beneficiary, structured so that any claim from a spouse would have to go through a trustee with specific conditions. Beverly rerouted the annual gift to a separate account in Sandra's name only. Neither of these things hurt anyone. They just meant that what I'd built went where I intended it to go. Christmas that year was small. Just Sandra and me and Dorothy's sister Norma, who drove up from Chattanooga with a fruit cake nobody would eat and enough energy to power a small city. We had the smoked turkey again. We watched an old movie Dorothy used to love. Norma fell asleep in the armchair before 10 o'clock and snored through the credits. Sandra sat with me on the couch afterward, both of us watching the fire, and she said, "I keep thinking about what you said on the phone, about not making me smooth things over anymore." "Good," I said. "It's hard. I've been doing it for so long I don't always notice." "I know. You learned it trying to take care of everyone. You got that from your mother." I looked at the fire. Your mother was better at it than either of us, though. She knew when to stop. Sandra leaned her head on my shoulder the way she used to when she was small. "I'm working on it." "That's all any of us can do," I said. The mountains outside were dark and quiet, the same as they'd been on Thanksgiving night when I'd sat on Sandra's back porch and made up my mind. But it felt different now. Less like the edge of something and more like solid ground. I'd spent 38 years solving problems in other people's walls. I knew how to find the source of a leak. I knew that the longer you wait, the more damage it does. And I knew that once you fix the right thing, the whole system starts working the way it was supposed to. Sometimes that's all you can do. Find the source, fix it, and stop pretending the water isn't coming in. I've been turning that Thanksgiving dinner over in my mind for months now. Not because it still stings. It doesn't, not anymore. But because of what it taught me about the difference between a man who builds quietly and a man who talks loudly about building. Colin thought he was putting me in my place. What he actually did was show me exactly where the leak was, and after 38 years in the trades, I know that once you see it, you can't pretend you didn't. Here's what I've come to understand about the way things played out. Every consequence in that story had a cause that came long before the dinner table. Colin had been treating the people around him as an audience for years, performing success, borrowing against things he didn't own, using my daughter's trust as a buffer between himself and the truth. That doesn't collapse overnight. It collapses under the weight of its own design. Eventually, the way a wall with bad framing will stand until it doesn't. I didn't bring that wall down. He built it that way from the start. What I did was stop pretending I couldn't see the cracks. And that took something I had to learn late in life, which is that staying quiet in the wrong moments isn't the same as being patient. I'd told myself for 3 years that I was being the bigger person. What I was actually doing was making it easier for Colin to keep performing. Every time I absorbed an insult without response, every time I smoothed things over for Sandra's sake, I was handing him confirmation that there were no consequences. A man without consequences doesn't correct himself. He escalates. What changed things wasn't anger. It was clarity. The kind of clarity that only comes when you've thought something through all the way to the end. When you sat on a cold back porch and let yourself ask the question you've been avoiding. And the question I asked myself that night was simple. What kind of man do I want to be in the time I have left? A man who protects the people he loves with his silence, or one who protects them with the truth? Sandra is the one I'm most proud of in this whole thing. Not because of what she did after I sent her those documents, though that took real courage, but because of who she's always been underneath the smoothing over. She had her mother's instinct to hold things together. But she also had something her mother had, which Dorothy called knowing when the holding is hurting more than the letting go. Sandra found that in herself. That's not something I gave her. That was hers all along. I think about Keith's leased BMW sometimes, about how easily a person can look like they've arrived when they're actually in motion towards something they can't see yet. I don't say that with contempt. I was 29 once. I made my share of noise. But somewhere along the way, the noise stopped feeling like enough, and I started caring more about what I'd actually built than what it looked like from the outside. That's the only thing I'd want anyone to take from this story. Not that quiet people always win, or that the trades are better than business, or that fathers are always right. Just this. That what you build when no one's watching is the only thing that holds when everything else is tested. The integrity you keep when it costs you something. The judgment to know the difference between loyalty and enabling. The stubbornness to stay standing when someone tries to make you feel small. That's what I tried to pass down to Sandra. I think finally it landed.